Welcome everyone. Thanks for being recorded along with me. This is my nice recording blazer, so I look professional. I'm going to present today on a paper I wrote a while ago when I was going to Boston University. I studied under this professor named Kirk Vector McNelly, who does religion and science, and we came up with this class that I took with him on this Divine Action project, this series that of 6 different compilations of essays relating to religion and science. And the goal was for me to have an article published in a prestigious journal, which it got published in Zygon. This actually isn't the PDF of the exact file, because I was too late in ordering my electronic PDF. Thank you, Zygon. So this is actually an earlier version. So I noticed that an of is missing, and so please forgive me. There's a cleaner version than this. But anyway, what I wanted to write about was 2 issues that I see going through this series, and falsifiability and traction. And I guess just a quick background. In Vatican I happened 1869 to 70, and at Vatican I, they were still pretty skeptical about evolutionary theory. They were having to respond to it since in 1859, Darwin's famous Origin of the Species came out, and evolutionary theory began. And so the church was having a problem dealing with this theory. Many of the theologians at Vatican I thought it harmful against Catholic doctrine, specifically as it related to the humans imago Dei. How can you have imago Dei when you've evolved from lower primates? Now, let's see. One of the quotes from Vatican I is that relates to this issue of evolution is, quote, "Christians are forbidden to defend as the legitimate conclusions of science those opinions which are known to be contrary to the doctrine of faith, particularly if they have been condemned by the church." That's specifically relating to evolution. Now, the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church open up eventually when you get to Vatican II. And you have more of a spirit of progress. Chardin had earlier in 55, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, in 1955, wrote this book, The Phenomenon of Man, in which it's this Catholic theology, but it's mixed with evolutionary theory. Even prior to having really strong modern understandings of things like punctuated equilibrium in evolution, he still had this view, this evolutionary view that he mixed with Catholic theology. Now, this book wasn't exactly taken very well by a lot of Catholics, but it is worth noting. Now, in Vatican II, they had these thinkers like, who am I thinking of? Hans Kung. I don't know if any of these names ring any bells. Henry de Lubac. And the famous Karl Rahner. These were referred to as the Nouvelle Theologie, the new theology of the Catholic Church. Now, these guys helped to shift the paradigm in Thomas Kuhn's book indicates, and bring the church more into line with contemporary science, which they then accepted evolutionary theory. Now, when I mean accept, I mean broadly accepted that evolution can at least be compatible with Catholic teaching. It didn't mean that they put a stamp on all their books and said, we believe in evolution, we believe in evolution, we believe in evolution. But from Vatican I to Vatican II, there's this huge shift, this huge change in thinking. And later, it becomes more and more, throughout the years, it becomes more and more acceptable within the Catholic Church to believe in evolution. Now, JP2, John Paul II, I call him JP2 like he's my friend. I know him. Oh, JP2. Now, I'm not a huge fan as an atheist of organized religion or the Catholic Church, but for some reason, I love this guy. I mean, he's so sweet, and he was so, just for a pope, he's the coolest pope I've ever heard of, and he ends up appointing Benedict 16th, right? Let's see. Thank you. Benedict the 16th, who is now the current pope. And JP2 wanted the church to grow up scientifically, wanted the church to be involved in more dialogue with scientists, with physicists, with astronomers. So that's where this series emerges. Now, the series goes by a bunch of different titles. The Divine Action Project, DAP. Scientific Perspectives on Divine Action. That's the subtitle. Scientific Perspectives, Divine Action. It's also called the VO CTNS series. VO stands for Vatican Observatory, and CTNS is the Center for Theology and Natural Science. That's up in Berkeley, part of GTU, Graduate Theological Union, I believe. So anyway, those are some of the names for this. So this begins, let me see here. This begins in 1987 with JP2 bringing a bunch of philosophers, theologians, and scientists together in Rome to discuss all these issues, to kind of flesh out what does it mean to accept evolution? What does physics have to say to biblical teaching, etc.? All these issues. So JP2 asked George Coyne, who I highly recommend looking up George Coyne, is the head of the Vatican Observatory at this time. Strong proponent of evolution. Very, very strong proponent of evolutionary theory. Now, some of the names of the people that have been involved in this, you may know, you may not. I mentioned George Coyne, Robert John Russell, who does a lot of stuff on Christianity and physics, and he's at GTU. William Steger, Nancy Murphy, Arthur Peacock, Francisco Ayala, who Dr. Sweeney refers to, Kirk Vector McNelly that I mentioned, Philip Clayton, who I think we probably know by now, who is my advisor. Hi, Philip Clayton. John Polkinghorne, who, by the way, has written extensively on religion and science. I mean, this guy writes a book a week. Not anymore. I don't know how old he is. I don't know if he can still write, but Theo Meyering, Michael Arbib, these are just tons of big religion and science scholars coming together. Now, at first it seems very Catholic, right? It's being hosted in Rome at the Vatican Observatory. JP2 calls it. It already seems like it's going to be a pretty Catholic event. But what Coyne and others wanted to do was to incorporate Protestants. So there are some Lutherans in there. There are some, there's Presbyterians, there's Methodists, and there are just general non-denominational Protestant Christians involved in it. The one thing I criticize about it is that although it tried to be ecumenical, it was only trying to be ecumenical with Protestants. There are throughout these 6 volumes, I don't think you find one essay in it from any Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox perspective. So, I mean, ecumenical, if by ecumenical we mean Catholics and Protestants. We mean 2 out of the 3 branches of Christianity. So that's one critique I have of it. I have others as well. Now, at least they opened up to Protestants. That's one thing. Now, I find 4 key motifs throughout this series. Now, Barber, I don't know if you guys know about Barber's 4 ways of relating theology and science, but first is conflict, the conflict thesis. The second is independence. Third is dialogue. And the fourth is integration. These aren't my motifs, but these are something that need to be mentioned, things that need to be mentioned right now about how people view the relationships between religion, theology, and science. So the conflict thesis, we can all guess what that means, right? That religion and science are in conflict. There are many people that hold these views, from fundamentalist Christians, conservative Jews, conservative Muslims. I mean, they will say, no, evolution did not occur. Adam and Eve were created. God put 2 white people in the jungle. And then on the other side of things, as Dr. Sweeney likes to point out, you got the new atheists, you got the agnostics, you got the Dawkins, the Hitchens, the Harris, the Dennett, and these people who agree that these things are totally incompatible. Now, second, you have independence. That, okay, so here's the sphere of science, and here's the sphere of religion, but never shall the twain meet. So we can have our sciencey stuff over here, talking about biology and chemistry and physics and astrophysics, but then we can have our religious stuff over here, our theology, our traditions, our religious experiences, etc. Now, the famous guy is Stephen Jay Gould, who is the kind of representative of the independence thesis. He calls it NOMA, which is, Dr. Sweeney?
Non-overlapping magisterium.
Yeah, non-overlapping magisterium. So there are 2 different magisteriums. And he kind of, one of the problems that people have with him for his religion part is that he pretty much equates religion with morals, or moral philosophy. So you have your science over here, your morals over here. Your science over here, your religion over here. But they don't meet. Third, you have dialogue, which is that it may seem that we have these 2 things, but let's do the best we can to kind of bring them together, to not to integrate as much, but to at least dialogue about them. One of the problems I have with Barber's 4 ways is that none of these people have a problem with dialogue. It's such a generic term. Let's get engaged in dialogue. Who's going to go, no? I mean, even Richard Dawkins, yeah, that's dialogue. Even William Lane Craig, yeah, that's dialogue. But so the dialogue one to me seems pretty weak. It's like, well, who doesn't want a dialogue on these things? Everyone loves talking about their views. Well, extroverts do. But so anyway, dialogue. And the fourth is integration. If you were going to pick one that would represent process theology, what would it be? Integration, right? So science And it's like you could do, science and religion or something. You could model it however you want. But they integrate. Process theology is known very much to hold to integration. Now, the four motifs that I pick out from these published volumes is that they are all against conflict. So they're all post-conflict. Most of them have a problem with independence. To them, a non-active God is no God. That these things, it doesn't make any sense to compartmentalize these. Now, they were all for dialogue, of course, as I think anyone would be, and then they were all for integration. This is my view so one of the motifs is that they were into these. All the writers of these published volumes were into these two. So they were against scientific materialism and against independence. The second thing that they focus on, second motif that they focus on, is the issue of divine action. Remember, this is the Divine Action Project. So what they're looking for is this, the action. What is it that we mean when we say that God acts in the world? That God answers prayers, that God performs miracles, that God providentially upholds the world, that God continuously creates the world. That's creatio continua. What does it mean in light of modern science to say that God acts in the world? So this is their main focus, I believe. So even in things like Neo-Thomism and Thomist philosophy and Catholic thought, they make a sharp distinction between primary and secondary causes. Get a new pen here. Primary and secondary causes. Now, according to Thomism, who do you think would be the primary cause of everything? God. Who do you think are the secondary causes? People. So even when you have this sharp distinction, they still want to have some notion of God acting in the world. Not just through people, but also God himself acting. So even in a strongly Thomistic philosophy, they still want to have some action. They don't want an idle God. They don't want a God that does nothing, or they don't believe in it. Now, they're really critical of what's called an interventionist view of God. Anyone have an idea of what that may mean?
God is out here and then steps in and fixes things.
Yes, exactly. So here's the world, here's God. Not that you can do that, because God would then be out here and here and here. Anyway, but it's so the world runs, the world's working, and then God steps in and intervenes from the outside. That is the normal view. I don't want to say normal, but I think the common view held when we talk about miracles, when we talk about answering prayer, when we talk about God's actions, it's assuming an interventionist. God steps in, intervenes, and you can get this all throughout the biblical narrative too, of God stepping in, intervening. But they don't like this notion because they think it's funny that God would establish a world with natural laws that run accordingly, right? Laws of physics, laws of nature, and then tinker with it. Like what the inner logic of a God that would create a world that can run stochastically and run based on natural laws, and then God starts fidgeting or tinkering with the same world that he set up in a law-like fashion. So for them, that doesn't make sense. They see a conflict in the inner logic of a God that would do such a thing. But they also don't want to be a deist. They also don't want to be a deist that says, well, God created the world, kind of wound it up, let it go, and hands off. It's a laissez-faire God. They don't want a laissez-faire God. So it's tricky. What are you going to have then if you don't have intervention and you don't have deism? How then can we talk about God acting in the world? And that's what they want to find out. So the first motif that I mentioned was that they're into dialogue and integration. The second is that they're into divine action. Now I might as well put this out there. Dr. Sweeney was talking about these terms and how they're confusing, but they're looking for a non-interventionist, objective, divine action, NIOTA. So non-interventionist, we get what that means. Objective, okay? So they'll talk about objective divine action and subjective divine action, or special, objective or special, or sometimes they put it as general and special. So they're not simply talking about God acting in the world in a metaphorical or poetic way. They're talking about an objective action on God's part in the world. So this isn't subjective, this isn't metaphor, this isn't poetry. They really mean an objective action from God that doesn't intervene in the world. And we all know what divine action is. So that's what they're searching for. Now, let's see, a third thread. So first being these two, second being focus on divine action. The third that I found was that they really focus on change, and this should be very fitting for this class. Change and novelty in the created order. What does that sound like? What was that?
Sounds like process.
Sounds like process, right? And let's remember that a lot of these people are not process. Most of these people in doing this were not process. The closest you could get were some of the things that Nancy Murphy would say and the things that Philip Clayton would say. So it's not a process, but they're very much focused on change and novelty, which I think is another area that sounds very close to process theology. So, let's talk about the fourth. Oh, now this one does not sound like process theology. The fourth motif I found, so I'll say that's one, that's two, that's three. The fourth I found is scientific realism. Meaning that science creates models that accurately reflect the objective external world. So science actually tells you realistically what occurs in the world. So there are lots of critiques of this, scientific anti-realism, that we cannot know whether our scientific models actually map on or correspond to the actual world. We can have all these mathematical equations put together, but do we know that that actually corresponds, actually models, actually represents the external world, the mind-independent world, I think is a good way of thinking about this. That is mind-independent world. So that means the world is not dependent on our minds. That if we were not here, the world this physical world would still be running, birds would be chirping. It's not idealism. It's not Hegelian idealism. It's not Feuerbachian idealism. It's scientific realism. They really believe that science can map out how the world works. So when I say it's not like process, I don't mean that process is not scientific. I mean that they emphasize more the realism of the objective world, I would say, at least in this. Now, it's also called critical realism. So critical and scientific realism. That's the fourth. Now, okay, this could go on for a while, but let's talk about testability. Okay, so we were talking about this earlier, actually. How do we test these things? What does it mean to test in the scientific method? We can't put spirits in tubes. You can't. Can we test if God were to act in the world? If God acted in the world, how would we be able to test it? Would it be testable in principle? So if we think about this, if we think about an interventionist view, where let's say Jesus rises from the dead, right? This is Jesus rising from the dead, and objectively, not metaphorically. And would that in principle be testable according to science? I tend to think that in principle it would be. Because if there's any change or if there's anything happening in the physical world, in principle it could be tested. You could, like Thomas, touch his side and go, oh, I got touch, I can see, I can smell Jesus, he's here, there are people, there's an in principle way of testing it. But if we don't have an interventionist view, how would we test if God acted in the world? So that's one of the issues. Now, I go through critiquing Philip Clayton for a couple pages. I don't know if you've noticed that. It's always nice to critique your advisor. To a point, you want to graduate. Now, I can get into the counterfactual principle, but I think that falsifiability should be mentioned here. Because that's probably, I think, one of my main points here, is that if something cannot be falsified, is it worth believing in it? And is it scientific? So by falsification, I am referring primarily to this man, Karl Popper, who talks a lot about falsification. That is, falsification, the ability for something to be proven wrong. So if we cannot have the ability to prove something wrong, why believe in it and why say that it's scientific? For Popper, it's not scientific if you cannot, if in principle there's no way that you could prove it wrong. So I think for Popper things like this would be God, because he would probably say, how can I prove, how can I test and show you, how can I falsify the notion of God? I mean, how could I test this hypothesis of God? Now, Dawkins would say that God is a hypothesis that is actually a scientific hypothesis because God says something about the nature of reality. And if science is touching on the nature of reality, thus it should speak to the God thesis or God hypothesis. But there are other people who think, no, I mean, God can neither be proven nor disproven. And in that way, God's not falsifiable. Popper mentions things like Freud's theory, his egoism. That is, every act that we do is out of selfishness. It's out of selfishness. It's out of a desire for us to be happy. How can you prove that false? You would say, oh, well, look, there seems to be an altruistic act right here. But then you could say the person that did that, quote-unquote, altruistic act did it to make themselves feel better. And you say, well, no, the person jumped in front of a train to save someone's life. How could that be selfish? Well, it made the person feel better about themselves by jumping in front of, by being courageous, by being noble, by being sacrificial. It made themselves feel better. So how can we disprove egoism? Because it just ends up being a circle. Do you get what I mean when I'm doing the circle there? And then he talks about Marx's theory of history. You know, how can we falsify that? And then he talks about astrology. How can you disprove tarot cards or fortune cookies or whatever? How can you disprove these things? They hold in every possible circumstance. So it's like, I get a fortune cookie that says, you will, you will have a life full of different high points and low points. It's like, well, if anybody has a life, they have a life filled with high points and low points. So it applies to everyone. So what Popper says is that the more a scientific theory does not allow for, the more scientific it is. So the more that a scientific theory restricts, the more scientific it is. So if I say something that can easily be proven false, and it's not proven false, it's very scientific. Because do you guys get what I mean by this? What's that? Okay. Yeah, I'm saying that the fortune cookie doesn't restrict much. So when I say, you get a fortune, it says you're going to have a life full of ups and downs. What does that restrict? Right. Nothing. If I get a fortune cookie that says tomorrow your left foot's going to be cut off, I mean, that restricts a lot of things. Either my foot gets cut off the next day or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it's not scientific. If it does, that doesn't mean it's scientific either. There's things like coincidence and chance in sciences, and that's fine, even in a deterministic system. But so the more that a scientific theory restricts or prohibits, the more scientific it is. The less that a theory prohibits, the more that it allows for, the less scientific it is. So, what's that?
According to Popper.
According to Popper, and according to most people that study falsifiability. So, one of the issues here is, can we falsify divine action? If God acted in the world in a non-interventionist way, can it be falsified? Now, some of the theories are bottom-up theories, like Robert John Russell's, is that God will act at the kind of the quantum level, where quantum indeterminacy occurs, right? And could adjust things in such a way as to indicate probabilities of one way versus another. So, 51% chance here, 49% chance here. God may be the one that determines that this has 51 and that one has 49. So that's a bottom-up view, and that wouldn't be interventionist, according to Russell. To me, that would be. Because if God's changing the outcome from the bottom up, from a micro to a macro, he's still affecting the macro. So it's still intervening at a quantum level, in my view. Russell has ways of explaining this that would take a long time to flesh out, but there's that. That's the bottom up. Then there's a top down, like Arthur Peacock, where he calls it like the whole part relation, right? So it's called downward causation. This is upward, and this is downward. So kind of the way that your whole body, as you were talking about having these different areas, but like even your whole physical body together as a whole can affect a certain part of your body. So in this model, God could affect downward in a downward way, the way that a whole can affect a part. So that's top down and that's bottom up. Now with in conclusion, I think my conclusion with all this is that there are problems in falsification and falsifiability here. Because if we want it to be scientific, it needs to be a theory of divine action that can be proven false. And how could we prove this top-down model false? How could we prove this bottom-up model false? And if we can't, why should we believe in it and why should we think that it's scientific? Now, I spend a little bit critiquing Tracy after critiquing Clayton, but and then McNally, I critique a little bit, but I'll just get to the conclusion here. And I'll actually just end by reading the conclusion. It is my sense of this series that its primary difficulty lies in locating non-interventionist objective divine action in the physical world. Where does it happen? And if it happens, where? Show us where it happens. Even if one were to accept the proposal of Robert Russell, according to which God could act in quantum indeterminacies, we would still have to ask how this act shows up or manifests itself macroscopically, like I was mentioning here. Thomas Tracy notes how in quantum theories of divine action, quote, a condition must be met, namely that quantum chance at least sometimes make a difference in the course of macroscopic events, which was just my point. For otherwise, they may disappear into classical deterministic regularities, which would render them largely irrelevant to the theologian's interest in special divine action in the world. If God acted at the quantum level, and this act made a difference macroscopically, then we could easily say that this act is measurable. One of the only proposals that appears to escape the problem of locating divine action is Arthur Peacock's, in which God influences the world by guiding and directing its course in a manner that may be compared to the process picture of God as a divine lure. We would only be able to locate those acts in retrospect, though. We would look at the past and see where God has lured us thus far. Yet this idea of divine action cannot be tested philosophically or scientifically. Thus, it is confronted by Clayton's critique of traction for its lack of derivability and testability. So the various TDAs, theories of divine action, put forth throughout the series are unique and intellectually stimulating, but they all face the problem of traction with the sciences. If we are to accept that there are non-interventionist objective divine actions, then we need to locate them within the physical world. If they cannot be located, then they remain on par with an elusive gardener or an indetectable tiger. The elusive gardener is, it's like me saying, I have this gardener that gardens for me, but you can't see him, taste him, touch him, smell him, but he's my gardener. The indetectable tiger is, I have 5 tigers in my lawn, but you can't see them, touch them, hear them, etc. So the indetectable tiger. That's what I'm saying is it's paramount to having an indetectable tiger and an elusive gardener. Similarly, the problem of the relationship between special and general divine acts is important. To have a special act of God runs awfully close to interventionism, yet to retreat from this leaves one with a view in which general acts swallow up special acts. If any theory of divine action is to be scientifically viable, these and many more problems must be addressed. This series is one of the most sustained attempts at doing so, and it will surely go down in history as one of the finest research projects to take place within the ever-progressing field of religion and science. That's my spiel. And, there's a lot more in there, but I would bore you guys to death, and I don't necessarily feel like I need to go into critiquing Clayton or Tracy or my old advisor. But what do you guys think? Problems, questions? I mean, you guys read it, I assume.
Can you make the distinction between how a lure isn't intervention?
How a lure is not? Okay, so with... Okay, now that's good. You've had a lot of good questions. So now it's tricky, but for these pens just die up, don't they? For a panentheist, right? This is what.
I have some from my book.
There you go.
There you go one. I go with red. I mean, it's pretty.
Well, I could see that. One of those should work.
All right.
Famous last words.
All right. So here's the panentheistic model. World, God, right? The world is inside of God, or the world is God's body. So God acts on the world the way that a mind acts on a body. Now, the difficulty here is that is there an intervention? Because if we say that a mind acts on a body, we would say that the mind intervenes on the body in some way, causally. So that's one thing that I'm sure Clayton would have plenty of responses to. But with the process model, since it has this, the lures are here, right? But wait, no. They wouldn't actually, because there wouldn't be anything outside of this. So the lures would be like this, like drawing this forward, correct? Now, is drawing the world forward intervention? It could be construed that way if this somehow comes into here. So say people are here, and the lure has causal efficacy on your decision making. Then you could say it was interventionist. But you notice how this is different, than world, God, and intervening. See?
I think is what undercuts the argument about the process being interventionist, because God is part of the cosmos instead of separate from it.
Exactly. So, yeah, to intervene implies something outside going inside. But if we are going to make a conceptual or physical difference between God and the world in panentheism, we still have to answer, is God acting on the world? Is that intervention, even if it's part of the whole? See, this is Peacock's like whole part thing. You know what I mean? So the whole acts on the part. And whether or not, I guess it gets down to what do we mean by intervention, and would this be intervention or not? Now, I would tend to think that if the lure but the lure is not a causal force, right?
Well,
that's a question.
in traditional terms, it'd be Aristotle's final cause.
Okay.
That's traditional stuff. That doesn't necessarily work here.
Yeah, exactly.
By that.
So if we want to say that the lures are causes, like a lure can cause you to think otherwise, like to change your view on the environment. If a lure can cause that in you, then it would be intervening. But it wouldn't be intervening from the outside in, it'd be intervening from the whole to the part.
Well, then the parts affect the whole.
Another good question. According to process thought, yes.
Works both ways.
Absolutely. It's a reciprocal relationship between God acting on the world and the world acting on God. But that's according to process thought.
Right.
In general, as just a, I wouldn't even really know where to begin on that. I assume that if you have a whole part relation, the part would have an effect on the whole, as the whole would on the part.
Which makes it different from interventionism.
Yeah, But you'll still notice that if we're going to make this line, if we're going to make a conceptual or a physical difference between the world and God, then we still have to account for this. Is that intervention?
I guess I'm more seeing it as if you took your marker and colored it all in.
Colored what all in?
The circle.
The whole circle?
The whole circle, and there was the circle inside, but to me it's like God is in the world too. Like,
But if I colored the whole thing in, we wouldn't be able to make the distinction between God and the world.
yeah,
It would just be pantheism.
yeah. I guess I'm okay with that.
Yeah, okay. Well, then you might like Spinoza. But yeah. Those are very good questions. Anyone else?
Isn't part of intervention the idea that it's somehow breaking laws of nature, it's changing laws of nature?
Yes.
And if lures are still kind of falling into the idea of you have all these options, but they're all within the laws of nature, they're all possibilities. I don't see how that would be intervention.
Good. Exactly. See, here we go. Now, this is exactly what I mean. I don't have all the answers on this, and that's good. And no one does. But yes. So normally, when you think of intervention, you think of breaking natural laws, suspending natural laws. There's a natural law that people don't rise from the dead, but a resurrection would break that law. So, yes, intervention is about breaking laws of physics or suspending them. Now, there's got to be a good critique to that. I haven't formulated it yet. Until then, I will concede. Yes, good. That's good. That is a good defense for process thought as not being interventionist. Because it wouldn't be breaking or suspending laws. Yes. Anyone else?
I had a question, not so much based on your presentation, but based on some other parts of the paper.
Okay.
It's page 18 on my copy on Word, but where you're critiquing Tracy mostly,
Yes.
and cautioning
Page 18.
theologians who want to point to science as, here, I have and you say that you should be careful of obfuscating facile interpretation of scientific theories. And I wondered if you could explain that and how then theologians and others who are trying to engage in this dialogue can more responsibly utilize or engage with.
Okay, so what quote exactly? I'm sorry.
At the bottom of 18, the sentence starts conversely, someone who assumes the metaphysics of causativeness.
Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah, okay. So conversely,
simplistic explanations of science or interpretations of science.
Yeah, okay. Conversely, someone who assumes a metaphysics of causal openness, like process theology, yes, should be careful in offering overly facile interpretations of scientific theories, since there are usually deterministic interpretations of the same, like the Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics, that may be taken into account. Okay, so what I mean by that is that, okay, quantum indeterminacy is the big one. So I could refer to Schrodinger's cat and the fact that there may be a superposition where something is both particle and wave at the same time and in the same way, which seems to be a contradiction. The cat is both alive and dead in Schrodinger's box. But in quantum indeterminacy, there's this point where things are indeterminate. We don't know how they will end up, right? Now, that's one interpretation of quantum mechanics. That's the Copenhagen, which is Niels Bohr, etc. Now, this is the canon for interpreting quantum mechanics nowadays. Now, there is another side with David Bohm, who interprets the quantum level in a deterministic fashion. So what I'm saying is that if we are going to, in the process trend, have a view, it's not just process either, most people have this view, if they believe in free will even, they believe in causal openness. So if you are going to accept the causal openness to the world, you're usually going to point to quantum indeterminacy for allowing that openness. But you can't just go, well, quantum mechanics says thus. Because it just so happened that these people got taken in as the canon. There's a strong argument to be made in this series by, forget his last name, that if Bohm's theories had come out a few years before Bohr, that this would be the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Can you summarize that view?
Oh, okay. Well, Bohm's view, that's tricky. It's been a while, first of all, so I'm a little rusty. Let's see, what does he call it? The hollow verse. So the collapse of the pilot wave. So as far as I remember, it's not going to allow for a Schrodinger's cat. You're not going to have superposition. One thing is either going to be light, or light is either going to be particle or wave at a given moment. And that there's no randomness or chaos or openness for events. They're determined by antecedent causes, and there's no indeterminacy. It's all determined. It's all determinate and determined. So now the argument that he makes involves advanced mathematics, which I can't do.
Right.
So I simply cannot flesh out his theory other than in popular parlance.
So even if you couldn't figure it out, like his reasoning for miracles would be science just isn't advanced enough to recognize them.
Whose reason?
The Bohm side.
Oh, I don't think he would allow for miracles.
I mean, that's what I'm saying. His reason would be we just don't know the reason of why it happened. Like if you couldn't figure it out,
Figure what out?
a miracle.
But they could, is what you're saying?
I just feel like casual openness leaves room for
Miracles. Mystery?
Well, okay, so I think I can get at the same point. In theory, if you can predict the future in a deterministic world, it's theoretical possible because everything is going to happen based on previous events.
But there's an epistemic limit that people have. I mean, our reasoning only goes so far. So you could say in principle, but would there be a person smart enough to do so? You know, maybe the supercomputer in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy might be able to. Yes, but it's you know, and David Bohm does a lot of dialogue with Eastern traditions that hold that, you know, time is an illusion, that freedom is an illusion, it's Maya. And so he connects the determinism here from this Western quantum view with Eastern traditions as well, which is pretty interesting. You'd be surprised on how many people don't believe in free will in the East and in the West. So, you know, I know it's heresy, but I don't believe in free will. And I'm not a Calvinist.
Can you break down why?
Yeah, because a free will would be a miracle. It would be a disruption in the natural order. So everything would be miraculous. Because, so, say everything has antecedent causes, antecedent causes, antecedent causes. Well, there's one thing here, my decision, that would be so free as to be outside of the causal chain. And if you're outside of the causal chain, it's, in my mind, it's miraculous. Everything would be a miracle.
So what's the point of making decisions then? We're trying to.
Well, I don't know what points are.
Or something like that. Like, why even bother trying if it's all going to happen a certain way anyway? That's just a.
Yeah. Well, that's okay. It's usually that, and then it's usually why be good after that. As far as, Armenians have been saying this to Calvinists for years. It's like, well, God's sovereign, God knows the future. Why do you get out of bed? Why do you pray? And they would just say, well, because God requires it. God wants me to. Not because my decision is going to change the world, but because God wants me to be, Now, for me, it's that although I think all these things are determined, I still experience the world as if they're not. I experience the world as if it was my decision to come and give this presentation. That I find meaning in this, even if I do think it's deterministic. So I don't think determinism necessarily leads one to apathy or to a hands-off, let's not be involved. I mean, I have deep concerns, deep feelings, deep sentiments for all kinds of things, and just because I think that the world is determined doesn't mean I don't care about those things or will pursue them. No, I'm not saying.
Just trying to see how you.
Yeah, that's what I'm. Yeah, and I'm not taking it. I wasn't taking it as a threat or anything. Sorry if I sounded defensive, but I mean, it's just that I don't find that determinism leads to nihilism or to apathy. In fact, there's an argument that, if everything is free, then why do anything? You can argue it the other way. Because everything is ultimately 50-50 if everything is free.
So I guess another question I have is, so...
I love Dr. Sweety's just don't agree with that. Just don't agree with that.
Think about this, what you just said. That you found meaning in. No, you're determined to find meaning in. You need to put the word determined right there as the front verb, in front of your verb, every time you do anything. Anytime any of us do anything. If the world is really determined, I was determined to interrupt you right now and say this, by all the causal factors that went into it.
Yes.
You're determined to respond the way you respond. You're determined to respond the way you respond.
Yes.
The reason you get up in the morning, if it's the Arminian framework, is because God makes you get up in the morning. God makes you want to get up.
You mean the
morning.
Calvinist framework?
Calvinist.
Okay.
You said
Yeah.
Arminian and Wesleyans before, so I don't know enough about Arminians to know.
Yeah. Arminian and Wesleyan are pretty much the same.
Okay, so the Calvinists.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if it really is determined, then all is determined.
Yes.
And even your feelings are determined.
Yeah.
And your feeling of having meaning in anything is determined.
Sure.
And
By all the arrows.
I find that very cruel.
And that's
somewhat off
determined too.
topic, but I find that very cruel. To the woman who is in a battered woman in her marriage, is that there was no possibility for her to not be in that marriage. It's determined that she's going to get killed by her husband because she, forgot to close the garage door.
Does that mean I think it's good that someone kills
it
someone?
means you're
No,
determined.
it means that just in a system of determinism,
But I don't throw my hands up and fall into
That's
faith.
determined too, that you don't do that.
Well, but
No, I know.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with that.
But is
No.
it determination based on all the arrows? Because
Yeah,
of
because
this, because of this, because of this.
you can't have a something uncaused in a causal world. And your free will would be uncaused or self-caused. It would be outside of the causal loop of the world.
I wanted to ask another question.
Yeah.
That's right.
In a free will perspective, you have a God that's sort of managing the world in some way.
Uh-huh.
And there's gradations of that, to be very general. So, but in a deterministic world, you don't need to have a God, but I think something I've wondered and want to ask someone that's in this perspective is that doesn't the fact that everything is determined sort of function the same way that a God does, that there's something larger than myself that is determining what goes on?
Yeah, it would be the eternality of matter, the universe, or something like that.
That's what those arrows do.
Right.
Yeah, it would be matter. You know, it would be antecedent causes. That there's nothing, I mean, if you can have an event without an antecedent cause, then you have a miracle.
Right.
And so if you don't have an antecedent cause for your free choice, then your free choice is a miracle. Because it's outside of the causal loop of the world. It's called causal closure, too. You know, I mean, the causal loop is closed. But I really want to address that, though. I mean, there may be people out there that believe that, oh, well, some battered wife, someone's getting raped or murdered, or, you know, the Holocaust, oh, well, that was determined to happen, so throw your hands up, who cares, right? But I don't have that view. I think that it gives me an impetus to care more, knowing that the world is not chaotic and random.
But even so, I'm not saying that you are
You're
cruel,
saying some
but that
people.
the system is cruel.
Oh yes, yeah. The world, nature's cruel,
I would rather have an illogical system than a cruel system.
and that's what, you know, difference in preference at that point, and that's fine. You can have. This is gone. By the way, this is we could talk about determinism and free will and determinism until we are all blue in the face. But, you know, there are lots of people who are determinists, theologians, philosophers, scientists, Eastern traditions, and, you know, they still find a strong impetus to be moral and promote social justice. And
They're determined to do so, and they don't acknowledge it. That's the.
No, they'll acknowledge that they're determined
I'm
to do
sorry,
so.
most of the ones I met with, you're an exception, will not acknowledge it.
Oh,
They will
most
not
people I know
acknowledge that I am
do.
determined to work for justice.
Well, they can't believe in determinism and not think that they are determined.
Oh, yes, they can.
Well-
They act otherwise, performative contradictions happen.
Well, that's
all the time.
what I'm saying is that even though the world may be determined, all of us act as if it's not.
And that's determined.
Yeah.
Yeah. And most of them,
You're saying most of them won't say that third yes?
they won't keep adding the determinant to themselves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it doesn't really bother me.
Dennett,
But,
Dawkins exempt themselves from their own determination.
oh, see, I don't. Yeah, I was.
Freud and Skinner exempted themselves from their own determination. I mean,
Yeah.
determinism, sorry, not
Well,
determination.
I not me. I'm determined to be so amazing, and no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I get your point, though. Some people may not. Most people, a lot of people will want to exempt themselves from that.
Or they will, yeah.
Or they will, yeah.
Say, I'm exempt. Everybody else is determined, but I know what I'm doing. I'm free.
Yeah, I certainly don't. I don't exempt myself from the
That's
web
part of
of causation.
One thing I want to say about Bohm is that apparently he started having a little change of mind later on. He came over and talked to the process folks, found some, I don't know the details. The book is entitled Physics and the Ultimate Significance of Time.
Mm-hmm.
Those conferences, he talked to the process folks twice, I think. And some of the papers ended up in that book.
Oh, okay.
He started being, what's the word? Less deterministic, I'm told.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know, again, I
Yeah,
don't know the details.
I'm just talking about his basic general
No, you're talking
theory
about
at the
early
same time. Yeah,
Yeah,
as
he came
Bohr.
out later in his,
Yeah.
before he died. I guess he started worrying about salvation or freedom or something, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
But-
Like Whitehead
Yeah.
towards the end of his life. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so he started changing a little bit
Mhm.
as things went along, but again,
Yeah.
I don't know the gory details.
Yeah.
Anybody's interested in that? We got the book over this.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's tough stuff. It's difficult. It's tricky. And I don't have all the answers. These are just my opinions. And I certainly don't act as if I know that they are the case. I'm still skeptical of my own beliefs. So,
Maybe what's coming to me is the hardest thing for me about determinism is that, because you're saying you don't experience the world as being determined, but in fact it is.
Mhm.
is that
Being deluded, or
fundamentally, your experience of the world is fundamentally not accurate. And you can't trust your own experience of the world because it's not accurate.
yeah, I'm very distrusting of experience
Right.
because everyone experiences things differently.
And I think that's one of, at least the field that I'm going into, there's a huge emphasis on trusting your own experience and learning to evaluate that.
Yeah. So yeah, no, there would be a disjunction there,
Yeah.
probably. Yeah, I think the hardest part of determinism is that, or the idea that nature is somehow deceiving me. Like, why is it that I think I'm free when I lift up my left hand right now? But, I can point to the Libet experiment where, milliseconds before I lifted my arm right there, there was a signal in my brain, milliseconds, that seems to be the antecedent cause to me lifting my hand. So it's like my brain lifted my hand. So there's all kinds of difficult problems that I'm not...
In the process world, that's a result of causal efficacy. Most of what happens is unconscious anyway. And part of the way of exercising freedom is to have things become more conscious.
Yeah,
And it's hard to do. Never saying it's easy.
yeah.
And that from the get-go. And that is, so it's
Yeah.
not, that experiment isn't a killer against the process metaphysics.
Yeah, and there are challenges of it too, just on the scientific basis.
Right. So was the plug actually?
Yeah, the issue of the threshold of decision and such. So anyway, that's my spiel. I know a lot of people may not agree with it, but thank you. Yeah. So deterministic atheists can still be good people.
That's determined. Question, in your
It's not their fault if they
review of
are.
this stuff, how many of these folks wanted to keep God's omnipotence?
Who?
In your review of all this material, how many of these theologians wanted days when all the fast shuffling was done? How many wanted to say God was omnipotent? God is finally in control no matter what? Or what group? Was there a group that,
Yeah, I think that there were some that were less so and some that were more so. And I think, excuse me, the ones that were more so tended to be a certain brand of Protestant. I don't know about Ted. I'm thinking about Ted Peters right now, the Lutheran. I don't know. I think he's still got a strong view of omnipotence. But like Vector McNally, Philip Clayton, like not so much. So it's on a spectrum.
right?
So yeah. So
I
they're
was curious, I didn't pick up much here, I just wondered if.
yeah. And the one thing, I mean, so the critique that, there isn't that much deliberate process theology throughout here, but there also isn't that much deliberate Greek or Russian Orthodox views on these things. So it has its own bias and assumptions, as any research project does. And so there are some problems with it, but there are also some things to learn, I think. So, yeah. All right, thank you.